Hello everyone and welcome to this video on country selection. Please do make sure you've watched the videos on internationalization motives and internationalization strategies before watching this video and the video on entry modes. So this is quite a complex topic for us to tackle this week. And we are going to be looking at a range of different models and frameworks. But the key thing is to understand that this is all very much contextually dependent. So we need to have high quality information about the particular company and the countries that we're considering in order to correctly use the models or to select the right models, as well as to examine the entry modes within that particular context. So for this particular video, we're going to be looking at the question of how international businesses select new countries and markets to enter. And to do so, we're going to be looking at two different frameworks, as well as a concept called scanning. So if you look at the three things that we are going to discuss, we have the OLI method, the Uppsala method, and scanning. The one thing that all of these very much have in common is that they are dependent upon the information that we put into them. So they are frameworks really for organizing information and placing it in such a manner that we're able to understand and identify deeper trends. But if we have poor quality information about the company that we're looking at, or poor quality information about the countries that we're looking at, then the models themselves or the methods and the concept of scanning is not going to produce anything worthwhile. So the old saying about garbage in, garbage out. So if we have poor quality information going in, then we are going to get poor quality output, poor quality decisions coming out. So if we start with the first of the three, which is the OLI method, often also known as the eclectic paradigm. This stands for, OLI stands for ownership, location, and internalization. And it's a framework really to help us evaluate what kinds of unique entry modes would be useful for particular countries. So it's a recognition that selecting a country or a new market to enter is not as straightforward as just purely looking at the countries themselves, but we have to examine the countries and therefore the specific location advantages along with the internal advantages and disadvantages and status of the organization itself. So we cannot just say, is say Peru a good market for Pepsi Cola to enter, and just look at Peru. We have to look at, as well as the location advantages of Peru, we have to also look at the actual internal status of Pepsi Cola, their ownership advantages, internalization advantages, as well as things like the micro external environment, so competitors and so on. So it's a recognition that there is a significant interaction and interrelation between these three different categories of advantage, and we have to understand all three categories of advantage in order to make decisions on country selection as well as entry mode selection. The second thing that we have to note about the OLI method is that it's quite a good way of understanding FDI, or foreign direct investment, that it requires a specific lineup of advantages across all three categories for FDI to actually become beneficial. So the basic underpinning assumption is that companies will avoid actually engaging in FDI if it doesn't bring about specific cost savings or specific advantages, that they would prefer to use external partners. They'd prefer to go outside with other companies unless all of these advantages line up. So FDI, foreign direct investment, typically setting up infrastructure facilities and operations within a new market or a new country is not something which organizations will engage in unless very specific advantages actually line up for them. So if we look at each of these three categories turn by turn, the first one that we have is ownership advantages. So an ownership advantage really is understanding the internal strengths of the organization, whether they have proprietary information, whether they have ownership rights over particular resources or technologies, any non-tangible assets. So these are things like intellectual property, so copyrights, trademarks, patent rights, how strong non-tangible advantages such as branding and so on are within the organization, as well as internally available skills, so the strength of human resources, all of these intangibles. So if there are ownership advantages, that gives the organization a degree of competitive advantage that allows it to proactively internationalize. Now, if you're internationalizing for reactive motivations, things may be slightly different. So we do have to understand the micro external environment, particularly the competitive environment. That does change things, but if we're looking at proactive motivations, there really does have to be some form of ownership advantage. Now, if you do have some kind of ownership advantage, so you have some intangibles that work in your favor as an organization, you have, for example, significant amounts of intellectual property or other non-tangible assets, then that does open up the door to all three of the particular market entry modes that are looked at by Dunning and the OLI method. So licensing, exporting, and FDI, foreign direct investment, are all possible candidates. And we can say very much that the greater the ownership advantages present within the organization, then both the greater likelihood of proactive internationalization, but as well as giving organizations competitive advantages that will lead them to likely a move overseas, either when it comes to their operations and production, or when it comes to engaging with overseas markets. So it is a base requirement really for proactive internationalization and for engaging in overseas commercial activity. So that would be ownership advantages. If we move to the next of our three categories, we have internalization advantages. Now, this can be quite easily misread as internationalization, since we're using that word a lot as well. But this is not anything to do with internationalization, but rather internalization. So looking at the advantages of keeping particular processes in-house, so internal to the organization, as opposed to making them external. So allowing those processes to be given out to third parties, to outsourcees, or to partners outside of the organization itself. So we need to understand in this case that particular processes may be cost effective for organizations to do out of outside of their own internal structure, so in which case there aren't any internalization advantages there. If this is the case, then certain types of engagement with foreign markets will no longer become viable. But if there are internalization advantages, then this opens up the use of things like FDI. So if we take a look at the impact of having an internalization advantage, and how that impacts our availability or the suitability of various entry modes, we can see here that internalization or having an internalization advantage would rule out licensing as a viable means of market entry. So we can see that if a company does not have any advantage of keeping things in-house, then licensing, i.e. taking some non-tangible asset of some description, so that can be copyrights, can be patents, that can be trademarks, and licensing them out for use in that market by third parties and partners, is only viable in the absence of an internalization advantage. If you have an internalization advantage, so there is some core process that is really important and brings significant value from keeping in-house, then licensing is not particularly a viable path forward, because it would mean giving up some of your internalization advantage. It would mean actually giving up some of the benefits of keeping that process in-house. So exporting is viable when there is an advantage, and FDI is viable when there is an advantage, because both exporting and FDI will keep key processes in-house. So it's important for us to examine the setup of the organization or the company that we're looking at, and make an evaluation as to whether there is an internalization advantage in that particular case. Another useful way of looking at this would be through the lens of core competencies. So if you have core competencies at stake in the product or service or the process that you're looking at internationalizing, then the more core competencies or the greater benefits of those core competencies, then that actually increases the preferability and the likelihood of engaging directly in foreign markets, i.e. through exporting and FDI. If you lack core competencies in those processes, then licensing becomes the greater the entry mode and the engagement with foreign markets as a more preferable course of action. So now if we move to our third and last category of advantage, and this is location advantages. This is where it's important to recognize how interconnected country selection and market entry modes actually are. We need to examine specific location advantages for the countries under consideration, and that should impact our understanding of what entry modes are available to our company. So location advantages are pretty much as they sound. It's some kind of advantage that the organization can gain from natural resources or from being present directly in the marketplace. It can be location advantages when it comes to the strategic importance of the marketplace. So for example, there's location advantages present in for online companies engaging in China, because it's the world's largest market when it comes to internet consumers and internet users. So this is a huge range of potential location advantages that could apply. It could just be natural resources. It could be the availability of particular resources in that area when it comes to operations and production. So what we need to do is look at each particular country, understand the processes and the operation of our company, and see what location advantages are actually present. And that will play again a key role when it comes to looking at internationalization. So if there are significant location advantages, so advantages in being directly present within that market, then not only is licensing not really a preferred method of engagement. So if you're licensing, you're not actually directly getting any revenue from the market. You're actually just gaining limited revenue from your licensees. Neither is export a preferred method of engaging with the marketplace, because with export, you're engaging in a fairly limited way with that particular country or that particular market. Instead, strong location advantages would create the groundworks for justifying the expense and the risk of actually FDI, so foreign direct investment. So directly going up and setting up infrastructure or directly going up and setting up operations in a foreign country. So we can see there that if we're looking for FDI, or foreign direct investments, or the most capital intensive and really the riskiest form of engaging in a new market, then we need ownership advantages, internalization advantages, and location advantages to be present. If we're looking at different countries and we're trying to evaluate different countries, what OLI does is it allows us to evaluate different countries while understanding that the different arrangement of advantages may suggest different types of entry modes. So it may point towards exporting, or it may point towards licensing rather than FDI, depending on location, internalization, and ownership. So that was the OLI method, but it does have some criticism or issues as well. In the OLI method, we'll examine location advantages for various countries, but it does not significantly take into account the physical distances involved, the various cultural distances involved, and really presumes that the standardized costs of engaging with different markets are relatively even. So it's a useful method for understanding the relationship between different countries, market entry, and entry modes, but there are significant drawbacks and shortcomings as well. What the Uppsala method, which is our second framework that we're going to look at, does is actually take a more pragmatic approach. So instead of evaluating different location, internalization, and ownership advantages and comparing different locations in a fairly abstract manner, the Uppsala method, which really was popularized by companies like IKEA, which had a very gradual internationalization process, is prioritizing expanding into countries with the lowest amount of distance, whether that's geographical distance, cultural distance, logistical distance, and so on, before moving outwards in an ordered manner. So looking to internationalize on a gradual manner, looking to build up knowledge and experience before moving outwards. So for countries like IKEA, it was moving out of their home market to other Scandinavian countries where there's fairly low cultural and geographical distance, before then moving to other North European countries like Germany and the UK, and then moving to Southern European countries like Spain and Italy and so on. So looking to use things like the cage distance analysis, so minimizing or engaging in countries where there's the lowest amount of cultural and geographical gaps, or cultural and geographical distance, and then as well looking to build up knowledge and expertise rather than rushing into wholesale FDI. And the way that companies or international businesses using the Uppsala method would build up this knowledge and experience would be to use the lower intensity entry modes as an entry point into the new market. So first looking to perhaps use licensing to establish knowledge and certainly to establish some kind of presence in the new market, even if it's by proxy, using exporting to build up direct knowledge of the market itself, and then perhaps moving to joint venture or other modes before really then using all of that knowledge and experience to directly invest using FDI, but that way would gradually reduce the risk of FDI itself, instead of jumping straight into foreign direct investment. So that's the Uppsala method, and hopefully you can see that both the OLI method and the Uppsala method while contrasting in their approaches. Both very much have strong connections between country selection and the choice of market entry mode. So those are two major decisions, or the two key decisions really, when it comes to internationalization, and they are decisions that have to be made in conjunction with each other. They have to be appropriate, both in relation to the organization but also in relation to each other. The next thing and the last thing that we're going to look at in this video is not really a model or a framework, but rather a tool or a concept, and that is scanning. So both OLI and Uppsala really do require strong information, awareness, and knowledge about the various countries under consideration, so the new potential countries or new potential markets to enter, and that's going to produce a mass of information, particularly today with online sources providing a wealth of information with very little effort required in most cases. So what scanning does is just a basic tool to allow us to organize that information for our particular purposes. This is the same basic principle as a weighted scorecard, which you may have come across in other units or other parts of your study. Scanning is really a variant of the weighted scorecard model, and what it does is allow you to organize information into a particular form and applied a pre-considered formula where you've weighed your key criteria against each other to allow you to present a single score to really capture your reasoning and to put the information through a considered process to get to particular decision making, enabling outputs. So if we look at an example of a scanning document or a scanning table, we have a few key things that we can highlight. So firstly, along the left, we have our variables. So these are the variables or the categories or factors that we think are particularly important when it comes to trying to compare different countries and select one country to enter. So these may be expressed in different forms. We can have required variables, which are either acceptable or unacceptable factors. So these aren't really a spectrum or can't really be expressed in anything other than necessary or blocking. So if a variable results in an acceptable output for a particular country, that's fine, and if it's unacceptable, then that country really shouldn't be considered at all. So the example we have here is allows 100% ownership. So if it's unacceptable, if that particular country does not allow for 100% ownership, then that would preclude any further examination or comparison for that country. Incidentally, that is a significant concern for many international businesses. Countries like China, for example, require international businesses investing in China to engage in partnerships with the local Chinese companies. So you're unable to, say, run a factory in China and have 100% ownership of that facility. It must be shared in partnership with a local company. So those kinds of variables are either yes or no effectively. Alongside of this, you have other variables which can give you a range of values in return. So the size of investment needed is going to be variable, is going to be on a sliding scale. Your costs, the tax rate, market size, projected market size, all of these things are going to be on a sliding scale. So what we would do once we have the list of variables that we consider important is going to be moving on and weighing them in relation to each other. So we're going to assign higher weights to the factors or the variables that we think are more important. So here we can see in this example the two highest weighted variables are well, in this case 2A, which is the highest, or the size of investment needed. So this is clearly a very important variable under consideration, and we also have risk of market loss risk. So risk is obviously an important consideration as well. We have to really have a strong understanding of the relevant importance of each variable in order to weigh them, but it's this weighing that allows us to have a nice ordered processing of the information that we gather. So once we have the weights in place, then what we're able to do is to look at each country that we're considering for each variable, get information that allows us to assign a score to it, and then we can multiply that score by the weighting, and then that will give us a nice weighed score. So if we have a clear relationship between the variables and an ordering of the variables, that allows us to order and process the information that we gather about those countries under consideration. And what that will do will provide us with weighed totals that actually reflect not just the information that we've found about each variable in each country, but will also reflect the different importance levels placed upon each variable.